Test, test, test. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. 1, 2, 3. And I hear the fans. Hi, this is Paul. I've got the filters on. I learned how to do that. Edson, who made the gift behind me, the painting, just said, I'm getting a migraine. And, okay, I'll try and figure out these filters. And so let me know if it sounds any better. I've got some fans blowing. It's cooler today, so it's not 105 out in Sacramento. And I don't turn the air conditioning on at church. So hopefully it still sounds good. Sam Tiedemann made a great video. I'm really glad that he made it. He's got a part 2 coming, and I'm really looking forward to that. He was taking on the forgotten history of moralistic therapeutic deism, and he played a bit of a well, let's just go through some of this.
Protestants, in terms of what that means in terms of the
fan comment in one of his videos. So here I am transfigured. The subject of this video is moralistic therapeutic deism. What is it and where did it come from? Paul Vanderklay recently asked me to make this video as an offhand comment in one of his videos. So here I am taking up the challenge. All right. So the term comes from a book called Soul Searching, The Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers.
Now, if you go back and into the archives, you'll see I've read from this book often over the years. I read this book not too long after it came out, and I probably got it from, I don't know if Drew was blogging back then, but anyway.
Written by a Christian sociologist named Christian Smith. He did a survey of a bunch of teenagers. The survey data is from 2002 to 2008, which means that the teenagers were born mostly between 1984 and 1990, making them, what you could call old millennials, which interestingly happens to be, I think, the main demographic audience of this channel, and also probably the TLC at large. That's probably the demographic average. They resampled them every couple of years. They had over 3,000 sample size, which is pretty good for that sort of thing. And they also did in-depth person interviews with some of the recipients, or some of the people in the study. So here I am. I'm going to play a clip of Christian Smith describing his findings.
Okay, another point that I draw out in this book is that the majority of American teens seem to me to be what I call functional, de facto, moralistic therapeutic deists. So what I came away from this project, and I got this from the interviews, not the survey, but I came away from this project gradually piecing together the majority of Protestant kids are not really Protestants in terms of what that means in terms of the historical tradition of Protestantism. The majority of Catholic kids are not really Catholics. The majority of Wesleyans are not really Wesleyan. I mean, the majority of Jewish, whatever their tradition they're raised in, they're not what they actually functionally, de facto practice and believe is not that religious tradition.
Now, the tradition that they're raised in, were their parents Calvinists or Wesleyans or any of those? Or were their parents deeply impacted by other things? This is the super tricky thing about dealing with this really slippery thing that we call religion. And probably from the start of my channel, part of the reason I made this channel is that when I look at YouTube and I look at Christian YouTube, and not only Christian, but religious YouTube, and all the battling over all of these different elements, part of me just looks at it and says, okay, you've got all these ideas that you subscribe to, but how do these ideas really function in your life? You go back to the Gray Hamilton, Annie Crawford, Jordan Hall video. Annie is making the strong plea for Christian formation. But if you take this combinatorial explosiveness idea, this thing goes down as well as it goes up. And how much formation is being done in terms of the regular ways that we live our lives? If you look at something like the Amish, there is a religion that deeply impacts the life of the people. But if you watch any of these ex-Amish videos, or where they're interviewing Amish kids, you can't sort of cordon the kids off from what's going on around them. And of course, the goal of many religious institutions is in fact that. And then of course, then there are many other, I hope the sound isn't too low in this. So I'll just move this up. Because now I've got all these filters on, I've got gates on. I think it's going to just make it so that I don't hit the upper limit. But the purpose of all of this intentional formation and child raising is to yield what the community imagines is exactly the kind of person they want it to be. This can get into the heretics video about what is progressivism. Well, you're always progressing to something. And while it's all very messy and it's all very inexact, there usually is sort of an ideal that people have in mind, and they either want to strive and achieve it, or they want their children to strive and achieve it.
It's this thing that I eventually came to wrap the words moralistic therapeutic deists around. So what is MTD? Actually, I coined this phrase, and then I was shocked when I went to the car dealership and found MTD magazine. You know, when you go to get your car fixed, there's like stacks of old magazines everywhere. It's MTD magazine, Modern Tire Distributors magazine. So I realized I hadn't coined MTD. But anyway, here's what I mean by it. The creed of MTD is codified from what emerged from our interviews. Sounds something like this. First, so 5 basic beliefs shared by religious teens of all stripes and not religious teens are also.
Now, it's really helpful to notice that what you have here is a creed in reverse. Because usually the way we work is that we have this creed, and I mean, Sam has pointed out, lapses in the Trinitarian application and imagination to the nth degree, because we're trying to go from the creed into real life. But now he's looking at all of these kids and saying, well, let's see if we can suss out a creed.
Practicers of MTD. A God exists who created and orders the world and watches over human life on earth. So it's theistic. And many teens I talk to just think the idea that there is no God is lunatic. I had a really neat non-religious boy from Idaho tell me, I used to believe in evolution when I was smoking dope all the time. And then after I stopped smoking, then I realized, that's crazy. How could the world have come into being without there being some kind of God? So teens are happy to believe in God. God is no problem whatsoever. And then generally there's this sense of the world has some order and there must be some God watching over the world. Second, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other. As taught, they believe in the Bible, and most world religions essentially teach the same thing. You should be a nice person. The third tenet of MTD is the central goal in life.
Okay, so if we look at this creed, you could say, well, the first is sort of ontology, all right? And the second is ethics.
Life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. It's very much about comfort with life, self-satisfaction, feeling okay.
And the third is sort of a low resolution, good, happy, not sad, good, not bad, pleasant, not suffering.
Hey, about life. Fourth, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life except when he's needed to resolve a problem.
Now this is where you sort of get the super thing in the sky, because quite implicitly, God is this character. He's a being. He's not, of course, you look at other religious, he's not the ground of being. He's not, there's all kinds of things on the menu, but God, and this, you get this very much from, let's say, reading the Old Testament. I was thinking about this actually Sunday when I was preaching on Moses and going through and reading some of the parts of Exodus, that for many people, God is a character in a story. And it'd be God number 2, character in a story.
I say in the book that the God of MTD is something like a cosmic a butler and divine therapist. Basically, is there to take care of when you call. Stay out of the way. Don't get too personally involved. But when there's a problem or a felt need, then you can call like the butler and God will take care of that or help you to feel better. But otherwise, God is sort of out there, hence the deism. and good people go to heaven when they die. And now, I know in some religious traditions it's perfectly fine to believe good people go to heaven when they die, but in other religious traditions...
Now, part of the points that people had made after the Charlie Kirk thing, Rod Dreher made this in his blog, everybody's a Protestant. The Catholics didn't stand up and say, Charlie Kirk is in purgatory. They might have had a little bit more cover from the other side of the political aisle if they said Charlie Kirk was in purgatory. And right now, the servants of God are mercifully purging Charlie Kirk of the sins of what's left of the punishment, of the sins on earth, and making him fit for heaven right now. When was the last time I heard anybody say that? Have I ever heard anybody say that? What I really liked about Sam's video was Sam is working on a project that in some ways has been one of the projects behind my channel right from the very start. Because if you're a minister, one of the things you're doing besides sort of having your own theological matrix and discovering that, because we all have it sort of implicit in us, and then sort of comparing it to the text, if you're Protestant, comparing it to the let's say the Bible or a church tradition or a theological heritage or something like that. But you're trying to figure out, well, what's in the minds of all of the other people out there? There's this character God that's floating around. Again, many times over the years, I've made the comment that for many people, there's sort of a pantheism that's out there, and the word God has sort of been attached to something more like that. God is everything that's around us. And you get that sort of from Star Wars. Now, Sam runs through a lot of really interesting points all the way through. Playing one of my favorite videos, clips to play. Some really interesting thing about the... part of the question is, how do these religious assumptions seep into our cores unbidden and unnoticed? And this is something that, let's say, parents who have a real desire to form and influence their children are struggle with. Part of the reason I was very interested in the Ray Hamilton, Annie Crawford, Jordan Hall video was that the people of the Christian Reformed Church have been working on this actually very hard for a very long time. And there have been a lot of different movements in that story over the years, and I've covered some of that in some of my videos. From in the 1920s, the Christian Reformed Church prohibited worldly amusements, no theater going, no card playing. By the time I get to Calvin College in the 80s, suddenly we're into cultural exegesis. It's important for the discerning Christian to go to the movies and to discern the worldview of the movie and compare it with his Christian world and life view, and then in a Kuyperian way, somehow bring to the culture this world and life view, displacing the less theologically correct ideas out there. We're to leave Calvin College in some ways in the 1980s as winsome culture warriors who are thinking about the culture and watching movies critically and analyzing their implicit worldviews. Part of the reason I think James K.A. Smith goes to Calvin to teach there is he saw this tradition and said, oh, my cultural liturgies, what better place, what better community to join exegeting and analyzing and critiquing and engaging these cultural liturgies than a community that has been self-consciously doing this since the 1960s, because from the 20s to the 60s, we didn't go to the movies, and then the darn Sound of Music brought the Christian Reformed Church into the movie theater. I remember, I think the Sound of Music was potentially the first movie that I think it's the first movie I can remember seeing, and of all movies, of course, even though we didn't really pay a lot of attention to this whole business about Catholic Austria, the Habsburg, and that Maria was a woman who would never become a nun. Maybe that sort of warmed our Christian Reformed Church hearts because we saved her from the dreaded exile of being a nun. And now she could be a good Protestant, well, Catholic wife. And, well, they already had the children to raise. But then, of course, we're Dutch Calvinists, so the Nazis are the bad guys. We know that because, of course, I was driving in a car with John Van Donk and Job and someone else, and Job made a quip about Rotterdam. It's like, oh yeah, the Germans bombed that even after the Dutch surrendered in the war. So Monty Python, don't bring up the war. So Sam just walks through a ton of things here, which I thought was really helpful. Even gets into some of the neo-Orthodox in college as a at the end of my history taking. I was an undergrad in history. I decided to write a paper on MLK Jr. to get into his theology, and didn't really know much about neo-Orthodoxy at that point. But Martin Luther King Jr. was a well-educated African American, and one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is how diverse the American Black church is in many respects, with many different theologies. The African American church is not a theological monolith by any means, and in fact, elements of that church tend to mirror different elements of what's in the culture overall. And so then Sam has all of these different elements that come into it. And I think he's right. There's all those different elements in it. But what's interesting is that these elements just come into the culture and they're much more caught than taught. In fact, this is part of the critique of sort of the straightforward imagination of, well, how do people learn things? Well, we have them memorized. Well, they'll learn some things that way. And so catechesis right now, in terms of the hot place in many Christians right now, is catechesis and formation. We need to catechize our children better. And in the Christian Reformed Church, that catechesis had the form of the Heidelberg Catechism. And a little bit before me, before, let's say, the movement of the counterculture in the 1960s and 70s, the way that you catechize children was you would send them home with the Heidelberg Catechism, and they would come back and they would be asked to recite the different Lord's Days of the Heidelberg Catechism. And the Heidelberg Catechism was taught in the evening service. And you were to recite and memorize the Heidelberg Catechism. And it's interesting because as an educational wave sort of moved through the church and thought, well, we don't want them memorizing the catechism. What we want them to do to engage it is to tell us what the catechism means in your own words, to demonstrate comprehension of the catechism. And, they very much have a point to that. But what they sort of lost was the value of memorization, whereas those words actually do sort of sink into you when you memorize them. So all of these theological ideas are floating around in the culture. And I think, in fact, we don't seldom have good imaginative analogies for how that works, that float in the culture. It's sort of liquidy, sort of watery, when it's by no means even, because, of course, high status people will have an outsized effect. And Christians who have been working on, maybe I'll play a little bit more of that video. Now, Stetson, the whining you hear in this video is not from my video. It's coming from the other video. Now, whether the filter can take it, the fan noise, I take full responsibility for. But the whining, that's from Jordan Hall's mic. You can take it up with him about the sound quality of his. He's sort of upped his studio game there a little bit, but
that's not how he acts in our lives. Like it's more embodied and relational in that. So that's really like what I was feeling when you mentioned that, Annie. Like there's the broken at all those different churches of all those different sizes. Like that is a key sort of broken spoke in the wheel.
Yeah, and that's really important to articulate, Gray. You said that very well.
Let me throw three brands or fire logs on the pyre here. First, Annie's version of it, what did you say, bitterness? And there were other...
Grieved.
Grieve. Yeah, grieve. For me, it's rage. So my version of that is rage.
Well, I was trying to use euphemisms, Jordan, but one reason I love talking to you is that
Annie's plenty mad, Jordan, and you manifest that better than Annie, apparently.
I don't feel so alone in the world, so carry on.
Hey, everybody's going to be pissed. I mean, if I send this to anyone, they're going to be pissed at me, so it's fine.
Yeah. All right.
I want to make a comment about the video I made this morning because it is sincerely, completely out of love. Because I hope the message in that video was, I welcome young leaders, new Christians, new young Christian leaders coming into the church with the zeal and the fire to do it better than what they've seen. I welcome that. The church needs that. It's because of those leaders that things move forward in the church. Now, it'll be plenty messy when they do. They'll make lots of mistakes, and hopefully they will also at the same time, it's sort of like, was it Chesterton? You got to give the old guys like me seats at the table, but don't let me stop you. You go build that perfect church. I will cheer you on, and I want to see you surpass me and do better than me, and even prove me wrong in places that I have questions and statements. But it's always, I came to the Dominican Republic right out of seminary, and my supervisor for my internship was my internship. My supervisor for my internship was the founder of the field. Of course, I'm a snot-nosed seminary kid, and I get in there, and I can make a list of how many things do I see wrong on that field. And my supervisor was wise. He just says, yeah, I could see that. But you weren't here when we started. So you're not really comparing it to where we started. And but didn't get defensive, didn't get upset. Just thought, let him engage, let him get out there, let him do some things, let him try to build something, let him go out there and do it. Now, what's interesting about all the flack, and I give Protestants all sorts of flack too, but it's a very Protestant thing to look at what's been built and say, we can do better, and we should do better, and then to go out and to try to do better. It's all good stuff.
So, all right, too. So this, might as well just dive into it. So the next one is this. With regard at least to Protestantism, the Protestant church has a structural historical problem, which is defined by being the Protestant church, by being protest. There's a moment of separation and the effort to reform. But one of the things that happened is it happened in the period of modernity, right? From the Enlightenment on. There's a coincidence of this machine. They were born at roughly the same day, like they're cousins. And so one of the consequences, and I ran into this first person, I was talking with my pastor with one of the problems that we have in our church, which is that we have lots and lots of really fruitful young families. And that's great, but they can't live in our community because they can't afford to get a house. All right. So what's going to happen? Are they going to have to like go further into the woods? Like just, is that we just going to have this incredible thing? We're going to produce these beautiful young families. And the second they want to actually live separate, as families, they have to leave and go far away from each other and from us. Obviously that's an abomination. So what's it look like? So I began talking about what we're actually doing is, we're going to find a way to create houses that they can live in. That's how it's going to work. And as the church, I worked on a model and said, here's a model where the church could participate in this. And here's how over 30 years, we can actually produce the infrastructure that takes this much money out of the mammon economy and puts it into the divine economy, et cetera, et cetera. And his basic initial response was very viscerally like this. And he's like, this sounds like Catholics. And I was like, first of all, And then second was, of course, it sounds like the Catholics because that's the last time in history where the church did anything like this.
Probably not. And so when I talked in the first video that I engaged this video a little bit, I talked a lot about the options in terms of schools, because again, Christian Reformed Church wrestled with many of these questions. And they came to America. They were poor. They pooled their money. They built schools together. Of course, homeschooling then wasn't such an option, but it was also the case that many of the Dutch immigrants didn't know English very well. So they wanted, you'd need teachers that could engage in English. You'd need teachers that had read English books. We're a little bit different in a place where homeschooling, but it was also the case that, many of the parents were farmers. And so actually what they had more of was land and less some of these other things. And so there's lots of questions. And then the question, again, back to Abram Kuyper and how the Christian Reformed Church did things in terms of sphere sovereignty. One of the things that you always had the difficulty with is that if you had the minister running everything, that could be a problem. Now, in some of the communities that my grandfather pastored, my grandfather was the most educated person in the community, and almost everyone else were farmers, probably with an eighth grade education. My grandfather, who was a minister, had sort of a college and a seminary education, and then went out to the church. But all the rest of my grandparents all had eighth grade educations. Now that is different, and so one of the questions is, should we have the minister drawing up contracts for land purchases? And people would say, no, you want a lawyer to do that. Oh, okay. Should the minister make decisions about what land to purchase? Well, maybe if you've got a realtor or someone who's in real estate or someone who knows something about property values, maybe they should be involved in that decision. Oh. And so very quickly what you have is you've got all of these aspects of society, but these aspects of society also get into questions of, how do we bring this idea of a community living together into the fore? And as I mentioned in the previous video, you get someone like Rafe Kelly, who was sort of living on some of the ideas. This is where you get into, let's say, the religious ideas in the water we swim. A lot of these ideas come out of the counterculture. Well, why can't we just live together? Why can't we do communal housing? Now, of course, there's some very old forms of communal housing. You can find Julian with his suspenders and his plaid shirts, and you can find the Bruderhof, and you can find the Hutterites, and you can find, and part of the reason that Christians tended to do better with these things is that Christians also had a heritage of, you know what, we're not gonna have unmarried sex as part of our communal lifestyle. And when we have marriages, then we're going to figure out how that works in the communal lifestyle. And we're going to decide what aspects of life the communities police and what aspects they don't. And of course, one way is to try to say, well, the community is going to police all aspects of life. And so we want the women wearing these kinds of dresses and maybe cover their heads. And we want the men wearing these kinds of shirts. And when they're unmarried, they'll be clean shaven. And then when they're married, they'll wear a beard. And we want them driving these kinds of horses and buggies. And we need to make decisions about the telephone. Well, let's keep it in the barn. And so people aren't just sitting there, but it's there for emergencies. And. Because part of the combinatorial explosiveness is, what do we police and what do we let free? And you always have to decide that, because there's more things than you can police. Now, when people don't recognize that, if you have sort of a limited number of things that are policed, well, you're going to need judges in either case. And so what sometimes happens with some groups is they become authoritarian, where there's one person at the top who is, let's say, the divine authority, and this person will make all the decisions for everyone down the chain. Now, most Protestant groups sort of resist that. But certain other groups that tend to have more hierarchical visions of authority, well, the great line of apostolic succession laid their hands on this person. So when I come to that person, I say Coke or Pepsi, he says, clearly RC Cola, or nothing with carbonation, or nothing with caffeine, because in many ways, you can look at the Mormons, they've been running a whole interesting other test experiment with respect to authority, and many of these issues, I want to get to the part I want to get to.
It's been 500 years since the church had this responsibility front and center. So if we want to begin to restore our proper responsibility as a church, we're going to have to actually go back.
See, and I don't think, that's a nice posture rhetorically. Doesn't really hold water, because the Reformations themselves have been extremely fluid, and Catholics and Protestants have been changing code all the way through. And in fact, in the middle of the Reformation, nobody knew it was a Reformation because they were all trying to figure out what to hold and what not to hold. And then you can have someone like Richard Rowland come into the conversation and say, you know, a bunch of the places sort of a ways away, they were trying other things and doing other things, and they sort of look more like the Orthodox. And then you've got Paul Kingsnorth coming in and saying, oh, by the way, they had all these tiny little, in other words, the combinatory explosiveness, the complexity of it all is enormous. And so right away, when you decide, okay, we're going to decide on education, who gets to decide? Does the minister or the priest decide what homeschooling materials everyone will use? Well, maybe the mom should decide. Oh, well, what gives the mom the authority? Part of what traditions offer are questions that don't have to be answered at the moment because they're just inherited. And a lot of those questions are and practices are simply inherited because this is the way we've seen them done. And now in this sort of multi-plural context, well, it gets complex fast.
In time to a period before Martin Luther was born. Well, that's going to have a lot of complicated effects for how do we reintegrate all of that into an ecclesial structure that presumptively jettisoned that responsibility as part of its core responsibility in life.
And when I hear a speech like this, you know what I think about? I think about this little map in Sam's video where part of what was happening in the beginning of the 19th century, the United States changes dramatically in the long 19th century. The United States begins, let's say the 19th century, let's say the 19th century begins with a successful American Revolution. Then you get the War of 1812, which is part of a much bigger conflict all around the world. But, you know, the Brits decide, no, we're not going to take back America. And Americans decide, no, we're not going to try and take Canada. But part of what's happening, as Sam nicely shows, in this very vital, vibrant area, which was sort of a frontier area, and they've got industrial, you know, industry starting to come in, and you've got the Erie Canal, and Sam makes a nice list here. Erie Canal completed in 1825. Don't forget, again, read Carlos Ayres' Reformations. 1492. That was Luther's generation when the world changed. Because when Europe sort of discovered the Americas in the way that it happened with Columbus, it was as if we went to the moon and found people that we could enslave, have sex with, wonder about their souls. It was a really big deal. But you've got all of this stuff happening. And I think Sam is also right that a lot of this, he talks about Park Street, which was nice. I really appreciate that. Was my sister's church. So much of this stuff comes down to New England.
Deism is an interesting balance of elite progressive opinion, but also popular level invention and adoption. The three main mechanisms of spread were elite emulation, people copying the elites, political dissemination, not forcefully, but, well, I guess, did Abraham Lincoln spread moralistic therapeutic deism by force or by charisma? Well, it might depend on which half of the country that you come from on how you answer that question. And especially public education. One key characteristic of moralistic therapeutic deism is it doesn't obviously appear as a religion, right? That's why Christian Smith is like, what is this thing? It's not a religion. There's all these religious traditions. This thing isn't a religious tradition. But because it's not recognized as a religious tradition, it can escape the anti-establishment clause of the Constitution, which says that, you know, government can't perpetuate a single religion. This means that Emerson and his idea.
And that move has been made a lot. If you go into, say, go into a public school and you might say mindfulness, meditation. Well, those aren't religious. Yoga. Well, none of that is religious. Oh, because if you go to a church and a chaplain comes in and I come in, I say, I'm a minister of the word in the Christian Reformed Church. I'd like to instruct your children on their ethics. No, we can't do that. That violates the Establishment Clause. Does it? Does it really? Because there's been a lot of different answers to that over the history of the United States. And the courts continue to have to sort of go back and forth. And this is part of the scary thing of what's happening with respect to, even though I have many, many videos about it, I'm deeply skeptical about the definition of religion that we use in the public space. It's also afforded us some really good things.
Ideas can be taught in public school without the same level of scrutiny as traditional religions, and apply that to all these other ideas. And I think you're starting to see my point. It's also the language which America describes and understands its own history. It's the grammar of America's universal history as we talk about it and remember it to ourselves. And really, like I said, Harvard's influence and domination of the education system at the university level, but also Harvard's university's influence on education and the philosophy and training that teachers receive, and how that then propagates down to public education at all levels. I think that just simply can't be overstated. And like I said, Harvard University became officially Unitarian in 1810. So many of the figures that I mentioned are in and out of Harvard University that really, that is the epicenter of moralistic therapeutic deism and the key to its success for spreading. Is moralistic therapeutic deism still a thing? I think a lot has changed since I was a teenager. I think it's worth wondering whether popular religion and ideas have gone through such a transformation in the 20 years since that book was written to ask the question whether moralistic therapeutic deism is still the right conception. The book was written in 2008.
I think Sam's correct on this. I think he's absolutely right. I think we need to continue. Well, again, how was I raised? I was raised, you have to be a cultural exegete. You have to try and figure out the implicit default religion of the culture you're engaging.
The last clip I played was Obama's inaugural address in 2009. But I think that was in many ways the zenith of moralistic therapeutic deism, but also perhaps its last gasp. Obama ended all of his speeches, "May God bless you, may God bless the United States of America." Could you imagine a future president, say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, ending her speeches that way? I don't think so. I'll make a part 2 to this video about what has happened since, and perhaps even where I think things might be going in the future. Thank you very much.
And I look forward to that, Sam. Brian Burge is a former minister. His church died, and now he's a Substacker doing graphs and charts about religion. And he's been doing his nuns project about the nuns, because part of what happened in over the last recent time was there's this big declaration that, well, Christianity is receding, and now the rise of the nuns, and Nathan Jacobs engaged this, John Vervaeke engaged this. Now Ryan Burge is digging into these numbers and says, but there are different kinds of nuns. There are nuns in name only that basically function as sort of American Protestants, and then there are spiritual but not religious. And they also, and in fact, they operate differently than the nuns in name only. And again, part of what a body needs, and of course it's perpetuated by education, by schools, by art, and when I say art, I mean also pop art, by the television stories we watch. And we've talked a lot about sort of the collapse of a unicentral culture. Now we have all these fragmented cultures, but even in the interfacing between these cultures and the rivalry between them, we're going to see in some ways certain common agreements that come out of them. There's always going to be implicit religious answers to a lot of these kinds of things. Now part of what, let's say, I would differ with Sam on in terms of his analysis is that I think there are different levels of religiosity, even poorly formed religiosity. There are different levels of a person's ability to articulate, let's say, a dogma which might be in the past and has functioned in ways that we perhaps don't even realize. Let's say the doctrine of the Trinity. And Sam is exactly right that if you go into many churches and you begin asking very specific questions to sort of suss out doctrines of, what their doctrine of the Trinity is, you will, in churches, you'll get a lot of really weak answers. I used to play this game with Jehovah's Witnesses, who would come to my door. Chances are I knew a little bit more about, on paper, what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe, let's say with respect to Christology or something like that. And so I'd ask them a few sort of leading questions if I had time on a Saturday. And usually some of the smarter ones would be like, well, why don't we send someone else to your house? Because they very quickly knew that I was sort of bringing them out of their depth and they didn't want to go there and they didn't want to look bad. It was like, fair enough. I'm playing a little game with you. If you decide you want to knock on my door, then I get to play with you a little bit. That's kind of the exchange that I saw in terms of the intrusion in my Saturday. They didn't always want to play that game, and fair enough. They were more than welcome to walk away, and that was fine. That doesn't mean that it's very hard to sort of get a mental picture, and we often need a mental picture of how exactly these things function under the surface for us. We don't know. And given the fact that there's so much going on under the surface that is getting expressed in actions and assumptions and expectations and emotional responses, it's part of the reason that I talk to people and I ask them questions. I ask them about this and I ask them about that. And every now and then I'll step on a landmine and be like, oh, I stepped on a landmine. They really got upset when I said that. What does that mean? What's underneath? And then we have these tools like surveys that we try to get at what's underneath. But of course, just like if I'm doing sort of individual questions and answers with someone, figuring out what they say doesn't necessarily, how much does that actually impact? And this is true of, let's say, a lot of the Ryan Bird stuff. It's interesting. I'm not saying it's worth nothing, but it's, here's the nuns in name only, spiritual but not religious, zealous nuns, these are the ones, and then duns. And then you have male, female, and then non-binary. Spiritual, not religious sort of has and the zealous have the larger non-binary, and the nuns in name only have the smaller ones, and they have the distribution of age. And it's all very interesting, but we're trying to get a handle on something. And our tools, we could ask ourselves, why do we want to get our handle on something? Well, everybody's coming to it with a different thing. Maybe if you're a pastor of a church, you want to get an idea of, well, how can I craft sermons that will bring more people into my church? Okay, so they're in your church. Now what? Well, I want them to volunteer. Okay, I want them to embrace catechesis and join leadership. Okay, I want them to raise their children within so these theological traditions are sort of like how Brett Weinstein sees genes. They just sort of are trying to make their way into the future without too much contamination, even though, another part of the video I really liked of Sam's was, let's see, where's he got here? I think it's after Oprah. It's his moralistic therapeutic deism as blind spots of Calvinism. You know, how does, and that makes good sense, because I think Sam is really onto something, that the moralistic therapeutic deism probably sort of came through the second wave universalism that went through Harvard, and then from Harvard sort of out throughout the rest of the nation, even though many people who went through Harvard weren't necessarily Unitarian Universalists. Did I say Universalists instead of Unitarian? Sorry, I keep saying the one U instead of the others, and especially when there's the UUs in New England, who have pretty much very pretty churches, but quite empty often. Yeah, there's a response to the other dominant group that founded Massachusetts. First the Pilgrims, and then the Puritans, and all of their ideas. And they're, of course, working through ideas that came to them through parents and grandparents, and these, you know, the spellings, as Brett Weinstein calls them, they sort of move through time. Now, part of what's going on right now is well, let's go with this one. I haven't mentioned Matt Whiteley too often. It's a little bit of a mystery in terms of exactly who Matt Whiteley is, but he's got his Substack, The Isle is Full of Noise, and he sort of takes on and usually complains about this or that. And you know, he's spoken out about you know, he's spoken out against Peugeot and some others, but he recently had one on Christian nationalism, and I actually liked his little thing under here. Christian nationalism is toxic garbage, and he knows how to write a clicky title. We will not solve the complex and pressing problems of immigration with rhetoric about martial Christianity. And I like that he used martial Christianity, because I think in many ways that's very much what people are reacting to. And I agree with him also. I see a lot of people who are just thinking that, yeah, what we really need is to fill. What we really need to do is elevate certain ecclesiastical institutions to a much higher place in the stack. And whenever I hear that, I just sort of chuckle, because I think, have you read the history of Christianity, either via Constantinople or via Rome, since Constantine? Because it's a super complex thing to manage. When I made my comments about this conversation about pilgrimage with John Heers and Paul Kingsnorth, and I made the observation that a lot of what's happening with sort of the increased orientation for orthodoxy, I think, is part of the renewed desire of people who have been living in a culture in its liberationist mode, looking for a culture that's going to be a little bit more rigorous, a little bit more policing in certain sectors. And they're hoping that this posture of rigor and a bias towards a little bit more policing of more areas will yield in their lives less chaos, more order, more intergenerational stability. But I don't think people are very quickly going to look for religious institutions to lean in. Again, as someone noted, it was super interesting seeing Father Josiah Trenum from the Riverside Church on Tucker Carlson's podcast, sort of thinking about the Charlie Kirk assassination. One person that he might have thought of to have on his podcast if he wasn't too busy might have been Charlie Kirk's own pastor. And I think Michael Sartori is very right that a lot of what we saw in that Charlie Kirk moment were the default settings of 1,000 little switches of American religiosity and American culture of how we do things. Jordan Peterson talked about the fact that to get from one end of the cornfield to the other, you've got to make all these little decisions. It's kind of a nice image, the cornfield. You know, do you go over a stalk? Do you go around a stalk? Do you go through another stalk? How do you get from one side of the cornfield to the other? There's 1,000 little decisions. And what we saw with the Charlie Kirk memorial service was some settings on certain dials that said, this is sort of the American thing. And there's a desire to say, let's have Constantinople or Rome or Geneva. The Calvinists, where are the Reformed churches? Where are the state Reformed churches? Well, you know, the Dutch, they had a state Reformed church. The Hungarians, they had one. Germany, you could pick if you're Catholic, Lutheran, or Reformed. In some ways, America has the implicit invisible state church, which is, of course, sort of the Protestant church. And that's the church that's functioning. But it's not a church that's an institution as such. It's not of this world in the way that Rome or Constantinople or Moscow are of this world. And so I've been to Ireland twice now. Enjoyed myself very much both times. Really love the Irish estuary guys. Loved both of the events that I had in Ireland. And that put me on I'm going to think about Ireland a little bit more. Because Ireland is such an interesting test case. Because, of course, the Irish were sort of at the end of the world until America was found. Ireland, that island, was the ends of the earth. And when you think of Ireland, you think of Catholics. And then when I went to Ireland, I noticed it's an extremely religiously diverse nation. One of the aspects of when we talk about Ireland, there's a lot of question about its relationship to, let's say, to England / Britain, because I've been listening to a bunch of the Rest is History podcasts on Ireland, and they have a variety of scholars on to talk about them. And one of the points that somebody made was Ireland was in some ways England's first colony. And that was an interesting thing to say. Because so I finished up that book on the Korean War. I found it very interesting. One of the most interesting things about that book, it was written in 2007. And the author made a great deal about the racism of Americans and how that impeded their ability to first fight the Koreans and then the Chinese because they were so dismissive. It was a common thing also during the Second World War in terms of the Japanese. And I don't have any skepticism about the racism in America or racism of Americans, and especially, before the Civil Rights Movement, so many of those assumptions were just kind of under the waterline. It was very interesting because when he talked about what Mao thought of the Koreans, or what Stalin thought of the Chinese and the Koreans, they were dismissive, had all the attributes of racism, but he never said the word racism. So Americans were racist. The thing is, America was dealing with a lot of that ethnic diversity for quite a while. And Russia was dismissive of Mao, but that wasn't racism. And Mao was dismissive of Kim, but he didn't label that as racism. Now, I would say probably all racism. And racism is just sort of one aspect of all of the mental ingredients that are going on. Would you say that the English are racist towards the Irish? Is that the word we would use? They're certainly dismissive of them. They certainly look down on them. They certainly tried to colonize them. And some of them decided they wanted to better them. But then very quickly, as you go through the history, you learn that there's a lot of Irish in England. There's a lot of English in Ireland. And in fact, they're pretty much like this in many, many ways. And so where exactly is this line that you're following? And then you get into religion. Now, the piece that I'm going to play is a statement that was made in the Easter Uprising in 1913. One of the points made in one of the podcasts was that if the First World War hadn't intervened, England probably would have had a civil war over this issue. But when I was listening to this statement from 1913, I heard something that I thought was so interesting.
Republic as a sovereign, independent state, and we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, of its welfare, and of its exaltation among the nations. The Irish Republic is entitled to and hereby claims the allegiance of every Irishman and Irishwoman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and all of its parts, cherishing all the children of the nation equally and oblivious of the differences carefully fostered by an alien government which have divided a minority from the majority in the past.
So that, ladies and gentlemen, is Professor Paul Rouse of...
And what's interesting is that 1913, it didn't say we're going to ask Rome to govern us from the Pope. We're not going to ask them to send an archbishop or a cardinal or a bishop to govern us. That you can be Protestant, you can be Catholic, you can be atheist, you can be all those things, but you're Irish. And we want to think about the Irish that are in London, and we want to think about Irish that are in England, and we want to think about the Irish that are in America, because of course after the famine in the 19th century, there were a lot of Irish. New York City had the world's largest population of Irish. New York City might be the second largest Dominican city. But all this talk about Christian nationalism, it's so interesting, where at the beginning of the 20th century, when they're trying to, home rule was an issue, they're trying to figure out who is Ireland and how are they going to govern themselves? And religion was just one of these footballs, because depending on what church you went to, well, you had different social networks and you had different statuses. And, you had this in America in sort of the Protestant mainline stack. The Episcopalians were on top, and then you had the Presbyterians, and then you had the Methodists, and then below you had the Baptists and Pentecostals, and those kinds of people. Of course, an immigrant church like the Dutch Calvinists, well, they weren't even on the map. They might have sort of associated with Presbyterians, but because they were our theological cousins, but and then I get the comments. One person that I talked to at the event after the Galway event said, when I was growing up, everyone that I knew was living in a family with their dad and their mom at home. Now, it's probably a millennial. Now, anyone who has children has only one parent at home. And everybody I know that's together doesn't have any children. So I continue to be skeptical about this whole project of, well, let's put an institutional church on top, and that will, what you're really talking about is policing. That will what? That will resolve the problems. That will bring unity. Skeptical. Usually what we do is we sort of work together with a big mess and a lot of rivalry, and we start new things. And new things grow, and sometimes they bless and sometimes they don't. So, all right, that's enough of this. Leave a comment.